All right, we want to welcome you back to our Thursday night Bible studies, and we are back to being virtual for about a week and a half. That's all we suppose that we're right now that we're planning on being virtual. But we've had a couple of people that have been sick this week, and one of them tested positive for COVID, and another one is being tested. So out of an abundance of caution, we decided to have virtual services here at the church today, Thursday, and then this coming Sunday, the 10th, or I guess it's the 10th, no, the 6th of December, and then we'll have virtual service again a week from today, the 10th. And so we want to invite you to tune in on the internet. And those that don't have the internet access, we are going to be sending them out as normal CDs of the services. So we're on the book of Mark tonight, and we are on Mark chapter 3. We hadn't quite got through this chapter yet. You'll recall that in the beginning of Mark chapter 3, Jesus is starting to have resistance not only from some local people, but from religious leaders that have now been curious about Jesus and have started coming up to Galilee to investigate what he's doing. And they were very suspicious, very hard for them to accept that he was a prophet, mainly for some of the religious leaders because he didn't pat them on the back or follow their line or come through their lineage. And so they were very resistant of him, and so they were kind of looking for a reason to find fault in him. And one of the ways that they sought to find fault in him was in his treatment of the Sabbath. And Jesus was trying to re-educate them about the Sabbath, that the Sabbath was created for the well-being of man and not the other way around. They had interpreted that man was made for the Sabbath and not Sabbath for the benefit of the man. So doing good on the Sabbath was not actually breaking the Sabbath. If you're helping somebody or rescuing somebody on the Sabbath, you're not breaking the Sabbath. But they had gotten so twisted in their thinking that they thought that was breaking the Sabbath. But the spirit of the Sabbath is that God created the Sabbath to help men. So helping men, and especially those that are in pain or trouble or sickness, is certainly not something that you would say is violating the Sabbath. So at the beginning of chapter 3, we see them getting angry at Jesus because he had healed a man with a withered hand, and he did it on the Sabbath day. As hard-hearted as that sounds, that's the way they looked at it. Even though a miracle had been performed in this man's withered hand, however it was withered, the Bible doesn't say, but they decided that it was more important to keep the Sabbath than recognizing that a miracle had taken place in their midst. So then the Bible says in verse 7 that there were great multitudes that started coming to Jesus from Galilee and Jerusalem and from Idumea and from beyond Jordan. And these were all Tyre and Sidon, which were cities to the north and west of Galilee. And so there were people coming from all the different provinces. There were some from this side of the Jordan River and some from the less populated eastern side of the Jordan River, some from down in Judea, some from even further south in Idumea, which was previously had been the land of the Edomites, which is where Herod the Great was from. He was from Idumea. And so the fame of Jesus was coming from everywhere, and as I said, the religious leaders were now starting to come and starting to try and find fault in him. And so the Bible says that not only did Jesus teach them and preach to them the gospel of the kingdom, that God's kingdom was coming, they need to prepare themselves, but that he healed many people and he cast out many devils. Now we left off in our last Bible study a couple of weeks ago with the appointment of the 12 apostles. We call this the beginning of the church, and rightfully so, because if you look at it, in fact I had somebody just ask me this question recently, Jesus chose 12 apostles. That's a strange number. He didn't choose 5 or 10 or 15, which to us would seem like more rounded numbers, especially 10. But he chose 12. And it was so important that when Judas betrayed him and committed suicide, when they were looking for a replacement, they had 2 logical replacements, but instead of taking both of them and making it 13 or leaving it at 11 and not choosing anyone, they knew they had to make that number 12. Jesus had put that in their thinking and in their minds, that that was the number. And the reason is because Jesus was restoring Israel. He was renewing Israel. So the church is the new Israel of God. The Bible says, I believe it's in the book of Galatians, it refers to the church as the Israel of God. Well, you'll remember that when Old Testament Israel started, you had Jacob, who had 12 sons, who became the patriarchs of 12 tribes of Israel. And so when Jesus reestablished the church to show us that he was reestablishing and reorganizing Israel around himself and around the new covenant, which was in his blood, he chose 12. And these apostles would then be the foundation layers of the church that would go out and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we talked about in that, the Bible gives the names of these here in Mark and in other places, and other of the Gospels. But it gives specifically their names here. And we went through last week talking, our last Bible study, talking about the story behind many of them, where they came from, and what traditions has happened to them. All of them, except John, were murdered and martyred for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And John, tradition says, was boiled in oil to kill him, but it didn't kill him, so they exiled him to the Isle of Patmos, where he received what we call the Revelation, the last book of the Bible. And so all of them laid the groundwork of the church through suffering. And I think that's important to understand, because, you know, if as I said just recently, no one would die. Josh McDowell's book, Evidence Demands Verdict, says no one would die for something they know is a lie. So why would you allow yourself as Bartholomew to be skinned alive, or John to be boiled in oil, or as Andrew to be crucified in an X shape? Why would you allow yourself to go through that if you knew that you were perpetrating a lie on people? They knew it wasn't a lie. They knew it was true, and that's the only thing that makes sense for them to have suffered the way they did. And so people can look back, as terrible as the martyrdom of these men was, people can look back with assurance of what they were saying because of their suffering. It makes us to understand, man, that must have been real and true for them to have suffered those things. And not only them, but all of the early Christians. It gave evidence to their faith and who Jesus was and what he'd done. So we founded the church, established it by establishing these 12 men, appointed them to be with them, gave them authority and power, and that power and authority moves on to the church in general to be the representatives of Jesus Christ. And so we go on now to verse 20. It says, "And the multitude cometh together again, so that they could not so much as eat." In other words, the crowds were now getting so great. We've already talked about earlier how that he was no longer able to freely come into the cities because the crowds were just so great. And anytime he did come into the city, they would just mob the home that he was in. And so these multitudes were so great, they didn't even have a chance to prepare the meals and to eat the meals, because the crowds were always there, always thronging him, always wanting him to talk and to perform miracles, which you could understand why they would. But, you know, man needs rest, man needs food. But it was telling you how great this gospel message was spreading, how quickly it was spreading throughout the nation of Israel. It says in verse 21, "And when his friends heard of it, they went out to lay hold on him, for they said he is beside himself." To say he's beside himself, we would say today he's out of his mind. So when it says his friends did this, the word friends there is a peculiar word, because what it means is those that were close to him. So it's not really the typical word that's used as friends, but it's talking about those that were near him. Maybe it's not talking about his closest relatives, but talking about the people that had been raised around him or knew him in Nazareth. And they came to him because they said he's out of his mind. Well, one of the things that we need to understand was that they were looking at it saying they couldn't accept the fact, and they couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that Jesus was who he was claiming to be, that he was a prophet. I mean, that's you know, the prophets were held in such high regard in the New Testament times that for someone to claim to be a prophet, or for the people to attribute them to be like Isaiah or like Jeremiah, boy, that was that was, just to them crazy talk. And especially if they've been raised around thinking, this is a man like any other man. This is no different than anyone else. And then he had such great crowds that were gathered around him that even made it even more alarming to them that he was allowing these people. And then there was whispers now that this was the Messiah. And, oh, we can't have this. This is, this can't be the guy. If you're raised around someone, it would be very difficult for you to accept the fact that this person was more than any other person. And when we get into it in a little bit, you think about his family that was raised there in the home with him, his brothers and sisters, thinking about the fact that this guy that they ate with and slept with and lived in the home with, that this guy was not only a prophet and the Messiah, but that he was the Son of God. So here come these friends or these acquaintances that were saying, man, we've got to stop him. This man's acting crazy. He's out here. He's left the carpentry business. He's left his mother. He's left his hometown, and he's traveling around to these synagogues, making it out like he's some kind of prophet. And I think this is inspired to be written here because anyone that starts to do anything for God can be looked at that way. When you start living contrary to the norms of society because you're sold out to a life of faith, then the world around you is naturally going to look at you and think that that's unusual or that's crazy that you would do that. John the Baptist was the same way. Jesus said John didn't eat or drink among you, and you said he's a devil, that he's possessed. That's what the religious leaders said about John. So if you're going to live for God, you've got to accept the fact that people are going to say all manner of evil against you. And Jesus, it's recorded here to show you that even Jesus, the Son of God, the most righteous man who ever lived, the God incarnate, received such ridicule from those who were closest to him. Jesus himself made the statement, he said, a prophet is not without honor, save or except among his own household and among his own kin. Now that they'll recognize him as a prophet in other places, but boy, trying to wrap your head around the fact that that's a prophet and you're related to them or you're raised with them to acknowledge that there's something more than that, he said it's very difficult for those closest to them sometimes to do that. I know even in ministry, when I was starting out in the ministry very young, it was a whole lot easier for me to travel away from where I was raised and to preach and people accept what I had to say than to be right there in my own home or my own town, because those people had seen me growing up, and I was always a cut up, and so in their minds that's just Bruce, and the idea that he's a minister and he's out here talking to people about how they ought to live and things. Well, they saw all the faults in me that I had growing up. So it's very difficult for them to wrap their heads around the fact that I was a minister, and not anything ill from them, but it's just hard to accept that, hard to look at it in that way. But, anytime, again, you go out to do something great for God, to the world that doesn't have faith in a coming kingdom, it doesn't make sense. I remember I tell the story that I heard years ago about William Borden. He was the heir to the Borden dairy fortune, and early on in his life he became a Christian, and not just a Christian, but a real Christian, a devoted Christian, a devout Christian. And he determined that he was going to go and become a missionary, and he turned his back on the family business and the family fortune to go out and to become a missionary. And I think it was 33 years old. He died on the mission field in Egypt. And they found in his Bible that he had written when he had first gotten saved, no retreat. I'm not going to turn back. I'm going to keep going forward. And then he had written in his Bible when he got ready to go on the mission field, no reserves. I'm not going to hold anything back. I'm going to give my everything to serving God. And then when he lay dying at 33, they had found he had wrote one more statement in his Bible. It said, no regrets. Even though he was dying at 33 years old, thousands of miles away from home in Egypt, he had no regrets for his decision. But looking from the outside, without the eyes of faith, you could look at somebody like William Borden and say, how could you turn your back on the fortunes of this life. I mean, you had a nice home you could have lived in, money to spend on whatever you wanted, and yet you turned your back on all of that to go and be a missionary. So to people it doesn't make sense. I remember Jim Elliot, who is famous for making the statement, "He is no fool who gives up that which he cannot keep to possess that which he cannot lose." In other words, we can't keep the things of this world. So it's not foolish to give up what we cannot take with us, to lay up treasures in heaven that can never be taken from us, to do things that have eternal value. And Jim Elliot, that said that, died at an early age in 1956, killed by natives in South America as he was trying to reach them for Jesus Christ. So people on the outside looking at Jim Elliot's life, or William Borden's life, or John the Baptist, who left society and gone into the desert and didn't eat what they ate, or dress like they dressed, or have the priorities that they had, all of these people would be looked at as deranged. And Jesus gives us an example. Don't think that the servant is ever going to be greater than the master. He said, "I want you to know they said those kind of things about me. And those close to me rejected me and wouldn't accept me. But I had to do what was right no matter what they said or no matter what they did." So his friend